Topic, that is, what is Linux? So this is kind of the thing that we want to talk about, what Linux really is. So let's start off by discussing philosophy. Like, every operating system has its own philosophy. Windows, Mac OS, Unix, Android, all of them have their own philosophy. Now, the grandfather of all operating systems was the Unix operating system. We'll talk a little bit about it later, but for now understand it was the father of all operating systems, and it followed a certain behavior. Now, Linux is something that follows that behavior, and it is different from Unix in the matter of fact that it is open source. Now, we will discuss all the differences in detail later, but now just understand this particular statement. Linux is Unix-like, but it is not Unix. Now, what is Linux over here? Linux, guys, specifically speaking, it is a kernel. Now, you guys will be like, oh God, what have you told me? You told me that there is a kernel now? What is a kernel? So guys, kernel is something that forms a big part of an operating system. So if we took an operating system and divided it into chunks, you can say 80% of the work that is being done by an operating system is being done by the kernel. So all the things that is said about the memory management, all the process management and the job scheduling and the driver management and input-output management, all of that is actually done by the kernel within the operating system. Then you have other things. You have things like extra system libraries. You have things that are system functions and applications that are bundled up with the kernel to form an operating system. Right? So you see the graphical user interface in your operating systems when you open Windows and all that. That is part of the basically that is part of your applications, not the kernel. So here you guys get the distinction. So Linux is a kernel. When you take Linux with other applications, you form operating systems. Okay? So Linux is a kernel. Now, what is Linux? It is an open source kernel that is used with other system libraries and functions to form operating systems. So that's why we have a lot of Linux based operating systems. Okay. So now let's look at the proper definition. Linux is an open source kernel which, when combined with system libraries and applications, forms an OS. So as we said, right, before we get to the history of things, this is, a good bit of context for you guys. But when we get to the history of how Linux came up to be, you guys will get a lot better idea. Okay. It is as simple as that, right? Just like the other operating systems like Windows and Mac, Linux-based operating system provides us similarly with an interface, right, which allows it to run specific programs with the help of the hardware. So it does the same thing that Windows and Mac does. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of distinctions and differences between all of them, but the core part is same. Linux is just a kernel that a Linux-based operating system is an interface for us to use the hardware we have. All right. Okay, so there are a few things I just want to point out. Linux is something that hasn't been used a lot in the world. It does not have the largest market cap. You're always going to see Windows that takes that victory, and then you have Mac, and then comes Linux. But these days, all the phones that you use, Android, right? Android is basically Linux based, so it wins over there. And a few more things about Linux. Linux is an open source kernel, which means that, it is free and people can just use it without paying or, licensing it. So it makes it very attractive for a lot of people to make an operating system without having to pay for anything, right? That's amazing. And it has a really large community that really helps it. And it also, the creator of Linux, he promoted open source philosophy where every software should be open source, every software should be free, and it should be available for everyone else to use for whatever purpose they want. It should be openly available, right? So that's the philosophy it follows. Now, let's move on and now discuss Linux history. So how did Linux come up to be? So Linux was a Unix based kernel. It was developed by Linus Torvalds back in 1991. So you guys might have heard of him. He's a genius. He's an amazing guy who basically wrote Linux's kernel from scratch. Now, why did he do it? And what was the implication of this? So he did it because of Unix. Now, Unix, as I had told you guys earlier, is the father of all operating systems that was made in the 70s, which even though it was made in the 70s, it was really, really awesome. But the thing was, a major problem with it was that it was a paid software. And Linus as a person really promoted or had the thought that, this kind of operating system should be free for everyone to use. So what he did was he looked at the working and design philosophy of Unix. He understood how Unix works and what it does, what its behavior is. And he basically emulated that when he created Linux. So Linux and Unix basically share the same design philosophies, but not the same source code. Okay. So we'll go into this later in a lot more depth when I cover Linux versus Unix. So that is all for now. Just understand that Linus made it in 1991 when he was a college student and he wrote it from scratch to create basically an operating system, but he wrote a kernel. So what they did was basically they took something called GNU applications and they packaged it together with Linux kernel and made a Linux operating system. Okay, so that was our first Linux operating system. One more thing to point out, Linus was not for naming his kernel Linux. It was somebody else who kind of coerced or persuaded him to name it Linux. He does not have that big of an ego. Anyways, that was the history of Linux in short. After Linux came out, everyone started using, all the enthusiasts and hobbyists saw what it was and started using it. And then slowly it started getting different versions because it was free. Everyone could just take it, make their own modifications and release it, right? So we got to see a lot of different Linux operating systems, and we'll talk about them when we're discussing Linux-based distribution systems. All right.